This video was made possible thanks to Olafly. Unlimited data for your next trip in seconds. More on that in a moment. The political whirlwind unleashed after Donald Trump's re-election is far from over. There are numerous challenges the new United States government will have to address. From the Gaza war to Ukraine, to the threat of Iran, North Korea. These are topics we constantly discuss here on VisualPolitik. But friends, if there's one thing that obsessively preoccupies Donald Trump above all else, it's precisely this.
China, 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 China. I've been saying China, 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 China. China. China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
Many have criticized the elected president for being too lenient with Russia and Putin's imperialist ambitions. And precisely because of this, many analysts are now asking a question. Trump claims he doesn't want wars, but what would happen if China ends up invading Taiwan? Would Trump be willing to seek a negotiated solution, as he proposes with Ukraine? Or on the contrary, would he intervene to protect this island? If so, are the United States prepared to do so? That's exactly what we're going to explain in this video. We're going to examine exactly what capacity the United States has, how China is preparing, and what the hell could prevent everything from spiraling out of control. So without further ado, let's travel to the other side of the world. The good thing about Donald Trump having already been president is that, more or less, we know what to expect from his foreign policy. And yes, there are things that have changed significantly since then, but there are others, like China's ongoing pressure on Taiwan, that haven't changed much, if at all, or have even worsened. The key point here is that Trump strengthened relations with Taiwan during his previous presidency. This, by the way, did not sit well at all with the Chinese government.
A few days after winning the 2016 presidential election, Trump called then Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen. It was the first time since 1979 that an American president or president-elect spoke directly with a Taiwanese president. And not only that, Trump ensured that arms sales to Taiwan increased substantially, from $14 billion during Obama's 8 years to $18 billion in just 4 years of Trump.
Of course, Xi Jinping's growing threats were also crucial in pushing Taiwan to buy more weapons. But in any case, the leap in military contracts was more than significant, and the position of the US government played a major role in this. In general, Trump has always been considered a friendly figure for Taiwan, but now the question is, to what extent would this president be willing to put American lives at risk to help the Taiwanese if Beijing invaded during his presidency? Friends, that could be a very different story. Don't forget that this tycoon has often repeated a certain idea: no starting wars and no being the world's police. The problem is that when we talk about China and Taiwan, we're not talking about a remote possibility. In fact, news like this is becoming increasingly frequent, and it doesn't look good.
Xi Jinping asked troops to prepare for war as battle drills intensify around Taiwan.
This might seem like just another threat, but the most worrying issue is that the threats against Taiwan are increasingly accompanied by massive military exercises and actual simulations of taking the island by land, sea, and air. For instance, just last October, Beijing used no less than 34 warships and 125 aircraft to simulate an all-out assault on the island. The exercise was named Joint Sword 2024B, and friends, it was B because there have already been 2 exercises of this magnitude in just the past 12 months.
Taiwan's President Lai says we'll resist annexation or encroachment.
And that's why the question arises. What if, one day, these maneuvers stop being mere exercises? What if Xi Jinping isn't bluffing after all? Well, in that case, there would be 2 possible scenarios. First, that Trump does nothing and simply sits back. In that case, Taiwan would probably end up, sooner or later, like Hong Kong. Then, the other possibility, of course, is that Trump takes action and does what Biden has already stated, not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are.
That's the commitment we made.
But then the question arises, could the United States actually do it? Are Uncle Sam's armed forces truly prepared to defend Taiwan if Donald Trump decided to go ahead with it? These questions are critical to understanding this entire conflict. Today on VisualPolitik, we'll answer these and more questions. But first, traveling to a distant destination like Taiwan can be challenging if you're not well prepared. The time zone difference, the language barrier, a different currency. There's no doubt that with our smartphones today, most problems seem smaller. However, a smartphone without internet can be as useful as a bicycle without wheels. Well, thanks to Olafly on your next trip, you won't need to spend a fortune on international roaming services to stay connected. With Olafly, you can make the most of technology with their digital card, the eSIM. Forget about physical cards, having to open up your phone and risking losing your original card. With this virtual card, you can instantly get your mobile data plan in over 200 countries without interruptions, over 150 of them offering unlimited data without relying on Wi-Fi or expensive rates. Simply visit their app or their website, select the plan that best suits your needs, and then install the Olafly International eSIM with a QR code or through their app. And that's it. In no time, you can discover the best places around the world, connect with your accommodation upon arrival, or share your best moments with family and friends through the network. Stay worry-free about your connection with Olafly and their unlimited data eSIMs for travel. Check out the link in the description to get 5% off any plan and destination on your next purchase.
Defending Taiwan, yes, but
There's one thing China has demonstrated several times in recent years. Even though it would be costly, they already have the capability to surround Taiwan and launch an assault on the island within days. Of course, it wouldn't be a walk in the park. Taiwan's coastal defenses are very strong and are designed precisely to increase the costs of a potential invasion. But the fact remains that Chinese military exercises around Taiwan are preparing Beijing to make this possibility a very real one. And if there's one thing that's clear, it's that any effort to prevent such an operation hinges on one absolutely crucial factor, that the United States acts very, very quickly. The question then is, should they do it? And the second question is, would they have the capacity to do so? Well, let's address the first question. From a contractual or diplomatic point of view, the answer is no. They are under no obligation. The United States and Taiwan have no signed agreement requiring Uncle Sam to defend the island in the event of an invasion. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which governs the relationship between Washington and Taipei, was passed after the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, states that Washington will provide Taiwan with the means for self-defense, but at no point does it mention any duty to directly defend the island. Now, of course, there's a difference between whether the US is legally required to act and whether it should do so for strategic and political reasons. And that's where things change dramatically. The fact is, with over 23 million inhabitants, Taiwan is one of the freest states in Asia. It's a consolidated democracy, a reliable ally of the West, and home to an extremely important tech industry. So trying to prevent it from falling into Beijing's hands seems more than reasonable. And that brings us to the second question. Washington has military bases spread throughout almost the entire Asia-Pacific region. In practice, the US is the only country with the real capacity to counter China. But now the question is, how exactly could the United States stop a Taiwan invasion? Well, let's start with the most important and strategic point of all. I'm talking about Okinawa in Japan. In Okinawa, the Americans don't have just 1, 2, or 3 military bases, they have 13 main bases. And if we include other military facilities, the number rises to 32 bases. This represents a massive deployment. To give you an idea, these bases would allow the United States to mobilize nearly 30,000 troops to protect Taiwan within just a few hours.
But that's not all. Across the rest of Japan, the United States has nearly 30,000 additional troops stationed, and together with the more than 28,000 currently in South Korea, we're already talking about a considerable force in terms of both resources and personnel of nearly 100,000 troops. And that's without counting the units deployed in Guam and in dozens, even hundreds of other bases spread across the Asia-Pacific region.
But even if we focused only on the most critical strongholds for Taiwan, namely the bases in Okinawa, we would already be looking at a force sufficient to halt a blitzkrieg invasion of Taiwan, at least for the time needed to bring in reinforcements. And we're not just talking about military personnel. From Kadena Air Base, also in Okinawa, the Americans could quickly deploy nearly 50 F-15 fighter jets to Taiwan. Furthermore, keep in mind that next year, dozens of F-35s are set to be deployed to this very base. And that's not all. This is just the beginning. In addition to the powerful air and ground capabilities stationed in Japan, the Americans also have naval forces, the Navy. And here's the thing. In the region, there's the Yokosuka Naval Base, located near Tokyo. This base serves as the headquarters for the US Navy's 7th Fleet. And then there's the Sasebo Naval Base, a joint naval base shared with Japan in Nagasaki Prefecture, where significant assets from the 7th Fleet are also stationed. And don't think this is a minor matter. The 7th Fleet is the largest US fleet deployed overseas. Seas. It's the largest concentration of firepower in the entire region. Its area of responsibility spans more than 124 million square kilometers, or almost 48 million square miles. It stretches from the Kuril Islands to Antarctica, and from the international dateline in the Pacific to the India-Pakistan border. Of course, within this zone is Taiwan, as well as other sensitive areas such as Singapore and the Strait of Malacca. And that's precisely why we're talking about a very formidable fleet.
The 7th Fleet itself comprises 50 to 70 warships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. Additionally, it has an embarked force of approximately 350 aircraft, including state-of-the-art fighter jets and helicopters, and tens of thousands of sailors and Marines. In other words, this fleet alone is larger than most navies in the world.
So this enormous fleet would allow the United States to deploy significant amphibious, air, and missile forces without even needing to move equipment from other locations. It could do so very quickly, practically within hours, and this is obviously a huge strategic advantage. In fact, one of its main military assets is the USS George Washington, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that can carry up to 90 fighter jets and helicopters, including F-18s and F-35s. In essence, we're talking about a massive mobile floating airbase. But it's not just about the George Washington. What stands out in this massive combat force is the 7th Fleet's permanent incorporation of at least 5 amphibious ships, 3 guided missile cruisers, 4 mine countermeasure ships, and at least 8 destroyers. These are ships that would be absolutely critical to preventing a potential invasion. And at this point, many of you might be thinking, that's it. Impossible. China will never dare to invade Taiwan. Look at what the Americans have set up here with their bases and fleets. No way. Well, let's not jump to conclusions just yet, because there are several issues at play here. First, regarding the bases in Okinawa, the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between Japan and the United States stipulates that Japan must authorize the use of American forces stationed on its territory against third countries. And, well, yes, it's very likely that authorization wouldn't be an issue. After all, Japan, besides being a close ally of the United States, also has significant economic interests in Taiwan, starting with its semiconductor industry. However, it's also possible that this authorization wouldn't come instantly and might take some time, which, honestly, wouldn't be surprising. Japan has become the land of bureaucracy and long, drawn-out processes, especially when it comes to politics. So let's say it takes a few days. You can already imagine the problem that could create. Every hour lost in responding to Taiwan's aid could be catastrophic for the island's future. And mind you, the Americans might face another small issue when using Japan as a base of operations in this hypothetical war. What's that? Well, the Japanese themselves, to be honest, don't seem particularly enthusiastic about getting involved in all this mess.
Majority of Japanese reluctant to defend Taiwan if China invades.
According to a 2023 survey, 80% of Japanese people fear that Japan would be dragged into the conflict if China attacks Taiwan. And that's not all. 56% responded that Japan should only provide logistical support, and only 11% supported the idea of Japan joining the United States to defend Taiwan against Chinese attacks. In other words, in the land of the rising sun, risking involvement to defend Taiwan is less popular than going on a diet at Christmas. Now then, if we say Japan has so many economic interests in the conflict island, why are so many Japanese opposed to defending them? Well, I think the answer here is simple, isn't it? China is a giant, and it's understandable that it's intimidating. But of course, maybe if someone explained to them that if China takes Taiwan, it would control almost all the oil arriving in Japan and fueling its economy, the situation might change significantly. Because yes, 95% of the crude oil imported by Japan from the Middle East, which makes up the vast majority of its consumption, passes through the Taiwan Strait. And the same is true for a large portion of Japan's imports and exports to Europe and the Middle East. If Beijing controlled this strait, Japan would find itself in a much weaker strategic position. Not because it couldn't import oil or export more Mazdas or Subarus to the rest of the world. After all, they could always reroute, but in that case, transportation costs would skyrocket and many economies of scale that exist in current shipping routes would be lost. In other words, in the best case scenario, Japan's economy would suffer greatly in the long term. And that's not even considering the multi-billion-dollar investments and deep economic ties its companies have with Taiwan. Who knows, maybe this would motivate the Japanese government to give the green light to the Americans. Or perhaps Washington might decide at the last minute to bypass the required Japanese authorization. Stop us if you can, don't you think? But friends, that's not the end of it. So far we talked about the military capabilities the United States has deployed in the region, but if you think the Chinese have been sitting idle all these years, you couldn't be more wrong. Some time ago on VisualPolitik, we explained how China has been transforming itself into a major naval power to counter US naval supremacy. In fact, back then we shared insights like this. China's naval modernization began in the 1990s and has resulted in the Chinese Navy becoming the largest in the world, at least in numbers, with 351 ships in 2022, ahead of even the US Navy, which had 294 ships that same year. What's more, not only does it have more ships, but their capabilities have also improved substantially since the 1990s, among other features, thanks to the inclusion of ballistic missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles, along with other equipment. And not only that, China has also a large fleet of submarines, destroyers, and cruisers. And on top of that, it even has managed to establish itself as the second strongest power in terms of having the most aircraft carriers. It's true that, compared to Chinese aircraft carriers, American ones are much larger and nuclear powered. But the Chinese, let's say, are playing some interesting cards to counteract that disadvantage. Do you want to know exactly what we're talking about? Well, pay attention to this news story.
How building fake aircraft carriers and destroyers in the desert could be helping China better threaten the US Navy.
What we're about to share sounds like something out of a movie, but no, it's happening right now. These are actions that China is currently undertaking as you watch this video. In the Taklamakan Desert, Beijing is practicing attacks against US Navy ships. How? By pretending the desert is a vast ocean and placing fake US warships, partially buried in the sand, that precisely replicate the size and shape of real ships. In fact, similar exercises were conducted in the Gobi Desert in the past, where satellite images revealed these mock-ups damaged, no less, by explosions from training missiles. So let's be clear, beyond the massive military drills around Taiwan, simulating an invasion, Taiwan is also training to carry out attacks against the very American fleet that could defend Taipei. Logically, this is done to improve missile accuracy and refine strategies. As you can see, everything suggests that China, whether they use it or not, is creating a comprehensive manual for invading Taiwan from start to finish, with every detail, leaving nothing to chance. And let me tell you, none of this is particularly reassuring, but there's more. China also claims sovereignty over nearly all of the South China Sea, a sea through which more than $7 trillion worth of goods passes every year. Want an example of what's happening? Look no further than the growing tensions between China and the Philippines. And mind you, here, unlike Taiwan, there is a mutual defense agreement. This means Uncle Sam would be obligated to defend them if they faced an armed attack. Now, is that likely? Well, you decide.
Chinese and Philippine vessels collide at a disputed atoll, and governments trade accusations.
Chinese ships patrolling waters that often don't belong to them have a peculiar habit of deliberately colliding with Filipino ships, and those from other regional countries as well. Against Filipino ships alone, there have been several ramming incidents in recent months. In August 2024, this happened at least twice. In September, it happened again, while a US 60 Minutes crew was aboard a Filipino vessel. And in October, it happened at least once more. These collisions are becoming increasingly frequent and closer together. And of course, if they're doing this to a country with a mutual defense agreement with the United States, it's because they feel truly untouchable. So keep a close eye on this situation. But beyond the fact that the region is as tense as a Charmander's first communion, there's yet another, perhaps even worse problem for the United States. Friends, in this case, I'm referring to the growing shortage in ammunition stockpiles. We mentioned this in several videos. The war in Ukraine has seriously depleted Western stockpiles. And of course, the United States hasn't been left unscathed. Unlike the West, North Korea and Russia, China is treating the war in Ukraine as if it has nothing to do with them. They haven't sent weapons, ammunition, or anything of the sort. And this could become a significant strategic advantage in the short and medium term, because clearly, this is a current problem that will likely be resolved over time. However, it will take the West a considerable amount of time to replenish all the weapons and ammunition sent to Ukraine, and, more recently, to Israel. For instance, when considering production times, restoring the ammunition levels that Washington had before the war in Ukraine will not be a quick or easy task. For example, it's estimated that it would take nearly 3 years to replenish HIMARS, 5 years for 155mm shells, 8 years for Javelin missiles, and up to a staggering 18 years for Stingers. Yep, you heard that right. 18 years. And to be clear, this doesn't mean that the United States is completely out of ammunition or unable to sustain a military campaign in Taiwan, but if the war were to drag on, the risks would become extremely high. The longer the conflict lasted, the greater the advantage for China. And yes, I know this scenario might seem like science fiction to some of you, but keep in mind that it's something the Pentagon would seriously consider before committing to defending Taiwan. In fact, along these lines, some analysts have run simulations of what might happen if the United States and China were to enter into a full-scale war today, not just a limited conflict over Taiwan. Well, these simulations suggest that with the current levels of conventional arsenals, the United States could begin to experience shortages of certain types of weapons, such as long-range missiles, in as little as 1 week of combat. And that's against a China that is estimated to already have around 10,000 missiles, of which approximately 2,400 are ballistic. So you can imagine it wouldn't be an ideal scenario. Not to mention that today, China's defense industry is operating at maximum capacity. This essentially means one thing: an absolutely massive production capacity, potentially much larger than what the US military-industrial complex can achieve at present. And no, these wouldn't necessarily be the most advanced weapons in the world, nor would they rival American technology, but they wouldn't be trivial either. For example, China already has relatively modern domestically developed fighter jets, hypersonic missiles, electronic warfare equipment, and combat drones, among many other systems. In fact, this is a news story from just a few weeks ago.
New combat drone developed. When loaded with weapons, it is able to fly as far as 11,500 kilometers and remain in the air for up to 40 hours.
Now, many of these simulations predict that in the end, the United States would prevail, but of course, the cost and the damage incurred would be substantial, and that's not exactly the best incentive to dive headfirst into a potential war, is it? But okay, we've already explained that China is developing the capacity to invade Taiwan, though the United States has the ability to repel such an invasion, and the complications that might arise with Japanese authorization and everything else. However, hold on, there's something we can't overlook. The idea that Trump could demonstrate clear support for Taiwan, just as Biden has done, might in itself be enough to deter any invasion attempt. At least that's what they think in Washington. Why? Well, on one hand, there's the military risk, and on the other, do you know what the acronym MAD stands for in English? Exactly, Mutual Assured Destruction. And sure, most of you are probably expecting us to talk about nuclear weapons, mushroom clouds, and all that, but no. Between China and the United States, mutual assured destruction wouldn't even require weapons of mass destruction. Pay attention.
The ultimate deterrence.
Friends, being rivals is one thing, but being enemies is something entirely different. And in this case, we're talking about two powers that are deeply interconnected. To start with, China is the largest, or one of the largest suppliers to the United States in critical sectors like electronics, pharmaceuticals, and processed minerals. So if the flow of this massive trade were cut off due to a confrontation between the two, both sides would suffer immensely. Tariffs wouldn't matter. As long as US imports from other countries include Chinese inputs, the dependency wouldn't change.
US-China trade hits record high despite rising tensions. Imports and exports between the two countries totaled $690.6 billion in 2022.
We're talking about more than $690 billion, a staggering figure. So yes, the United States could defend Taiwan and confront China, but at what cost? And when we ask this question, we mean for both countries. What would be the price for both sides to engage in this conflict? Because of course, much is made of Uncle Sam's and the West's in general enormous dependency on products from China, but that dependency is mutual. In fact, it's not clear at all how much it would benefit China to even embark on such an invasion. Imagine for a moment that a conflict breaks out in Taiwan. Overnight, advanced microchips become scarce. The car you wanted to buy costs twice as much. You don't buy it. You lose. And China loses too. Your Shein or AliExpress order probably never arrives. You lose, and China loses too. And so it goes for millions of similar examples. Which raises the question, are China's nationalist ambitions over Taiwan really strong enough to self-destruct in this way? Well, many analysts believe that the obvious answer is no. China directly exports 20% of its GDP, meaning that any sanctions or supply chain disruptions would plunge millions, tens of millions of families into poverty. So after having eradicated extreme poverty, would they take on such an adventure? It doesn't seem like the smartest idea in the world. And in this story of economies deeply intertwined, blowing up trade would itself amount to mutually assured destruction, and that might be Trump's best card. By simply expressing his support for Taiwan, it's likely that he could deter the risk of invasion for several years, exactly what Joe Biden has already done. In other words, perhaps it's time to end the famous policy of strategic ambiguity. To give you an idea, a prolonged conflict on the island wouldn't just trigger a global recession, but could, according to many analysts, reduce global GDP growth by up to 10%, nearly double the damage caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And unlike the pandemic, this wouldn't last just a year or two, but for a very long time. So this is the card Washington is counting on to keep things from escalating. Of course, this requires Trump to be clear about his willingness to defend Taiwan, just as Biden has been. But that said, the question remains, given the immense cost of this conflict and the military capabilities of both powers, how do you think events will unfold? Leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. Of course, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to our channel, it's free, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for being there, all the best, see you next time.